For as long as I can remember, I've always wanted to help people. I wanted to be the person who saves the day when someone is in trouble. I wanted to be the difference between life and death. I know it may sound like some silly, childish ideology, but that is how I really felt, truly, deep down in my core. I remember the very first instance when I wanted to enter the medical field. I was around 7 years old when my mother was dusting our kitchen with an old stepladder. I was sitting in the other room with a juice box, watching some mind-numbing cartoons when I heard the crash. For a moment, I didn't move. I just sat and listened, wide-eyed. Then I called out to my mother. She didn't respond. I got up from the couch to go investigate the noise. When I rounded the corner to the kitchen, I remember seeing blood on the ground, and my mother clutching her head motionless. My mother, being the cautious type, taught me from an early age that if I was ever in an emergency, if anyone was hurt, to dial 911 and tell them where we lived. Now, in my mind, at that age, I had always linked the police to 911 and had never really known much about paramedics. I was under the assumption that you had to call a special number for them. I held the phone in my trembling hand and punched in the numbers. The woman on the other end of the line asked me what my emergency was, but all my childish mouth could say was that my mom fell down. The woman calmly asked where I lived and I told her our address. She asked me to remain on the line and that help was on their way. For some reason, my body was incredibly nervous, though at that age, I'm not sure I understood exactly why. While I was lost in thought as to why I was feeling so worried, I heard a knock on the door. Quickly, I rushed over and answered it. 2 men in brightly colored jackets smiled at me, but almost instantly, their smirking faces darkened when they noticed the blood on my hands. They entered swiftly and made their way to my mom. Standing there watching them bandage my mother's head and insert an IV into her arm, I was awestruck. Not once did they panic, nor flinch, nor even cry. They loaded my mother into the back of an ambulance with me at her side, and we rode to the hospital. During the ride, my mother opened her eyes, grabbed my hand, and smiled at me. When we arrived, they took my mother inside. One of the EMTs knelt down and told me that I was a hero, that I saved my mother's life. It was in that very moment that I wanted to do what they did, to save people. My mother made a full recovery and I was well on my way to becoming an EMT. Fast forward 15 years. I had successfully finished high school and ever since spent most of my time taking course after course in my never-ending goal of becoming an EMT. After I was finally finished with everything I was required to do, I finally received my certification and was able to live out my childhood dream of saving people. In the classroom, they try their best to prepare you for a lot of different scenarios, although experiencing the real thing is much, much different. I remember the very first call I ever received. It was eerily similar to what happened to me as a kid, only it was the husband calling, and his wife, who was an older woman, had fallen down the steps. Only this time, she had broken her neck. By the time we arrived, there wasn't much we could have done. It was only a moment of despair that washed over me, but it was enough for me to almost regret taking this job. I took it to save people, and this woman couldn't be saved. It was then that my partner said something that snapped me out of my thoughts. He said if she needed us, we would have been here. And there are still others out there we can still help. It may sound like a cold, calloused statement to some, but it really opened my eyes to the fact that sometimes it's simply too late. But if we gave up now, then other people we could potentially save wouldn't stand a chance. Though, I'm having a really hard time trying to have that mentality lately. Over the last 6 months, I've responded to some pretty grisly yet bizarre scenes. The very first call that happened was made by a man who claimed that he needed someone to help him. Though, when probed for more information, he couldn't seem to give any. I didn't understand until I arrived. A lot of times during calls like that, they usually send police and medical just to cover the bases. When we arrived, the man who called was standing in the front lawn talking with an officer who arrived first. The look on his face was a mix of shock, confusion, and a healthy dose of fear. My partner and I grabbed our bags and made our way into the house. When we entered the living room, what we saw made us pause. Wall to wall, floor to ceiling, was completely soaked in blood. It was a disturbing sight. But what was odd was that there was no signs of any remains, no bits of a person, almost as if a person were completely drained of their blood and had the blood splashed around an entire room. The thing I remember most vividly was how my shoes squished in the sticky puddles of crimson. That sound still sent a shiver down my spine. One of the officers there ushered us out of the house, saying that no body had been identified. When I inquired further as to what had happened, he said he couldn't give out much detail, but said that the man told him that his wife had called him about an hour earlier, and said a stranger was at the front door. She said he knocked 3 times. Then the line went dead. Hearing that, it sounded like some type of serial killer with a fetish for hemoglobin. A few weeks passed and we received another call. This time it was from a man living alone in an apartment. He called frantically, saying that he had been followed home by something and that it was at his door. In case of potential violence between 2 parties, we were dispatched as well. This time when we arrived, I noticed that the door to the man's apartment had been ripped completely off its hinges. A nearby officer was already taping off the entrance. When we walked up, he nonchalantly said, "Not sure why they called you. Doubt you can do much here." We simply just smiled and nodded to him as we made our way inside the apartment. What we saw this time gave me nightmares for a few days. The living room was completely spotless. Not a speck of dirt, nor dust to be seen. All of the furniture had been neatly pushed aside along the walls. In the center of the room was a chair, and on the chair was seated the man. His hands rested gently in his lap. It looked almost as if he were posing for a photograph. But his face, his eyes had been ripped out of his head, and his tongue had been torn out as well. Although there was some blood around the sockets and lips, to do this to a person and only leave minimal traces would mean that someone had to have cleaned up the blood afterwards. My partner was speaking with an officer nearby. When he returned, he told me that they think it might be the same killer from the previous mysterious attack. The last call I received was the reason that made me quit my job. It was just another late shift. We were sitting quietly in our ambulance awaiting any calls that might come in. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, and we were dispatched to a location on the edge of town. We were the closest unit on standby. We arrived at a small suburban neighborhood with a small population. This time, we were the first unit to arrive, even before the police, which is pretty rare. Usually, we arrive at the same time or shortly after. We exited our truck with bags in hand and ran up to the door. We knocked but received no answer. Turning the knob, we found that the door was unlocked and we pushed it open. We found 3 bodies inside, each with very different wounds. The first was the father. His entire face was ripped away from his body. All that remained was tendon and bone. The next was the mother. Her body had 3 long symmetrical claw marks starting from the top of her chest, running down the length of her body. But what was odd was that there was no blood coming from the wound. Almost like cutting into a rubber doll. but there was clearly bone and flesh underneath. The last was the son, a high schooler, probably a football player. He laid next to them. At first glance, he appeared to be completely fine, but upon a closer inspection to the body, I realized that all of his bones had been crushed inside of his frame. His shoulders, his torso, legs, and arms. Everything was completely shattered as if he were dropped from a building or hit by a train. The only thing that had absolutely no damage to him was his skull. His head remained completely untouched. I didn't know what to make of it, and not a moment later the police showed up and blocked off the entire house. We were questioned, of course, since we were the first to arrive, and we told them everything and even our professional opinions. They thanked us and sent us home. It's been an entire week since that call, and I'm afraid to leave my house. During the first day, it was my day off, and being a night shift worker, I went to the store to get some late night snacks. When out of the corner of my eye, I thought I glanced someone following me. When I looked again, there was nobody there. Every day and night since, I glance out of my window and I see someone standing in the dark, behind a tree or a burnt-out lamppost. I'm not sure what to do. My partner called me a few days ago and I just told him I needed to take a personal vacation. I'm not sure why I lied to him, but I don't think I could just tell him I'm too scared to leave my house. It's been 2 days since he called, and whatever it is now standing outside my door. It doesn't move, only waits. I don't want to call the police because that hasn't worked for the others. I just dread what it's going to do to me. And if you find yourself in the same situation as I am, if you hear 3 knocks on your door, do not answer it.